I'm here, of course, to talk about Lyndon Baines Johnson, for whom, to you, it probably means very little. He was a president way in the past. You may think he's even close to George Washington in time period, but of course, a couple of centuries later. But it is past history to you folks, and I understand that. That's why I'm a professor emeritus now. I'm no longer teaching because I, in many ways, don't feel current anymore. But Lyndon Johnson was very current to me. During some of the most important years of my life, Johnson was president. And that's a chore for an historian, to have to write about an individual that was part of your own life and about whom you had, at the time, to say the least, very mixed feelings, very mixed emotions. But now, we are, 50 years or so, close to 50 years past the Johnson era. And so it's incumbent upon us to look at his presidency and what he meant to American history with a gaze that comes from less emotionalism. And that's what I'm going to try to do today. Lyndon Johnson without tears, really, is what I'm all about. This was his favorite picture, by the way. Lyndon Johnson, the kind of Texas cowboy, Texas ranch owner. Back in the late 1960s, the folk rock singer Phil Oakes wrote the song, "Love Me, I'm a Liberal." It's an ironic title because the song mocked liberals for their hypocrisy and moral cowardice. Oakes attacked liberalism from his perspective in the New Left, in other words, from a radical perspective. During the final quarter of the 20th century and into this one, liberals have fared even worse from assaults by the new political right on the opposite side of the political spectrum. Politicians whose records fit the term liberal, however loosely, a diverse group ranging from Michael Dukakis to Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, have run away from wearing the liberal label for fear of becoming the target of partisan character assassinations. In the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson's administration bore the brunt of much of the anti-liberal attacks. Yet, Johnson was a born-again liberal who shared an abiding suspicion of liberals. Expressing his contempt in the colorful language of his native Texas, he mocked. Liberals couldn't pour piss out of a boot with the instructions written on the front. Despite his ambivalence on the subject, Lyndon Baines Johnson has gone down in history as the second greatest, next to Franklin D. Roosevelt, and last of the liberal presidents of the 20th century. Johnson's political career spanned 3 of the 20th century's most crisis-filled decades and placed him at pivotal points in efforts to combat the Great Depression, World War II, and the Cold War. A proud Southerner with deep ancestral roots in the soil of Texas history, Johnson nevertheless operated for most of his adult life within the geographical confines of Washington, D.C. Nobody understood more than this descendant of the Texas Hill Country the political culture of the nation's capital, or practiced its main business with greater intensity and shrewdness. The New Deal first propelled Johnson's political development. In 1931, he became a legislative assistant to a Texas congressman and went to Washington in 1937 after he won the first of 6 elections to the House of Representatives. In between, he served in Texas, heading the Texas division of the National Youth Administration, one of the New Deal's successful agency. He became a leading member of Franklin D. Roosevelt's Young Guard. And throughout his upward climb, Johnson embraced Franklin Roosevelt's reform efforts, including attempts to supply work relief for the unemployed, extend electric power to rural dwellers, and reshape the United States Supreme Court. This is a photo of Johnson shaking Franklin Roosevelt's hand on a trip. The man in the middle is Texas Governor James Ulrich. Johnson came away from the New Deal with an ideology that sustained without straitjacketing him for the next 3 decades. Like Roosevelt, Johnson was neither rigid nor doctrinaire, but held a core set of beliefs that guided him through the legislative tangle of bargaining and compromise. A New Dealer who believed in the federal government's obligation to help ordinary citizens in distress, he also thought the government should provide opportunities for business interests to expand their profits. The Second World War and the Cold War offered rich prospects for defense contractors and oil companies, industries with which a politically ambitious Texas lawmaker had to satisfy in the 1940s and 1950s. Clearly, Johnson did not move in a consistently liberal direction. Serving 2 terms in the Senate, beginning in 1949, he initially took anti-civil rights and anti-labor positions that endeared him more to conservative Texans than orthodox guardians of the New Deal. Yet, as his later support for civil rights suggests, Johnson came to see the federal government as essential for removing the stain of racial discrimination from the South and lifting his native region out of the impoverishment that kept it behind the rest of the nation. The Johnson who trimmed his views to fit shifting political circumstances nevertheless remained constant in his practice of politics. Throughout his long career, he attempted to govern through consensus. Abhorring conflict, he pursued political solutions that produced many winners and few losers. His experience in the Senate during the 1950s as majority leader of the Democratic Party reinforced his preference for moderation. As he explained to one of his biographers, the biggest danger to American politics is the politics of principle, which brings out the masses in irrational fights for unlimited goals. Through the presidency of his patron, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Johnson was provided with a standard for measuring success when he entered the Oval Office following John F. Kennedy's assassination. He initially identified more with Roosevelt's successor, rather than Roosevelt himself, but with Roosevelt's successor, Harry S. Truman. Why? Of course, both of them had abruptly become president after the president died in office. Of course, Roosevelt died of a stroke. Kennedy died of an assassination. By the time Johnson became president, that's Johnson when he was running for Senate, campaign poster. This is Johnson talking to a senator when he was Senate Majority Leader. He's talking to the senator from Rhode Island. Johnson was well over 6'3", and he towered over people, which gave him an advantage. It was called the Johnson treatment. Johnson would come, look you in the eye, talk until you virtually had to capitulate. And he was very successful at doing that. This is Johnson with former President Harry Truman. The nature of liberalism had changed from Franklin Roosevelt to Truman, and Johnson inherited Truman's version of liberalism. Post-World War II liberals moved away from New Deal appeals based on economic class warfare and toward recruiting enlightened businessmen into the liberal coalition. Liberals put their faith in economic growth rather than income redistribution to lift people out of poverty without ruffling the feathers of the wealthy. At the same time, prompted by racial sensibilities growing out of World War II, including the Holocaust, liberals took up the cause of civil rights. Before then, in Roosevelt's administration, there hadn't been much effort in that direction. The pursuit of racial equality became the bellwether of liberal concerns with social issues and what today we might call identity politics. In the aftermath of JFK's assassination, Johnson committed himself to Kennedy's initiatives on a tax cut, anti-poverty program, and civil rights. He also reaffirmed the country's involvement in Vietnam, though initially concerns with domestic matters loomed far larger than did foreign conflicts on the other side of the globe. His first days and weeks in office, Johnson witnessed a succession of meetings and telephone calls with representatives of liberal labor and civil rights organizations, asking them to join him in fulfilling Kennedy's legacy. Johnson, notice the phones are different in those days, no cell phones. But Johnson loved working the phones. And as we now know, but didn't then, the phone conversations were all taped. This is before Richard Nixon got in trouble for doing that. But the phone conversations were taped, so today you can find recordings of what Johnson was telling his listeners on the phone in the most private of matters. To skeptics who worried that Johnson had wandered a long way from his days as a loyalist of Franklin Roosevelt, he assured them that he still was a New Dealer at heart and not a patron of Texas oil and defense contractors. Accordingly, he informed Walter Heller, whom he kept on as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, that, quote, John F. Kennedy was a little too conservative to suit my taste. Johnson quickly compiled an impressive record, easily surpassing that of both Presidents Truman and Kennedy put together. After securing a sizable tax cut that satisfied both conservative and liberal proponents of economic growth, Johnson turned to remedy the major flaw in his liberal credentials. As a Texas senator in 1949, he had opposed Truman's far-reaching civil rights proposals, helping to defeat them. His transformation then proceeded slowly, if not surely. During the following decade, with the dexterity of a surgeon, the Senate Majority Leader carved up two strong civil rights bills that had been introduced in Congress. He stitched them back up, and he assured their passage in acceptable, albeit weakened, form. Once he became president, Johnson recalled, unless he got out in front of the issue, the liberals, who in the past had criticized him for compromising the civil rights cause, would attack his credibility as president. Thus, he had to outperform Kennedy on civil rights, or Johnson contended his administration would be dead before I could even begin. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 exceeded Kennedy's original bill and enhanced Johnson's image as a proponent of racial equality. And let me just say, it wasn't just a political strategy. Johnson had come to believe personally and morally in equality of the races in this country. Having helped prepare the foundation for legislation by leading demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. asserted that with respect to civil rights, Johnson's, quote, emotional and intellectual involvement were genuine and devoid of adornment. In destroying legally sanctioned segregation, which is what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did, Johnson showed political courage, because he recognized that with passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, he had, quote, just delivered the white South to the Republican Party for his lifetime and that of future generations. The South in those days was solidly Democratic. And these were the folks that Johnson had to appeal to gain his consensus. But with passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the identification of that passage with Johnson and the Democratic Party, whites in the South were going to defect. And they have. Today, the Republican Party has its greatest hold in the South. And Johnson saw that. He knew it. But it didn't stop him from doing what he considered to be right and what was best for the country. And of course, he was pressed to do it because African Americans, the civil rights movement in this country, was not going to go away. And in fact, it was getting stronger and more vociferous. This concern about the South and his vision that he had lost the South because of his support of civil rights did not stop him from going further. In fact, a year later, Johnson signed into law the monumental 1965 Voting Rights Act, which one can argue has led to the election of Barack Obama as president. However, his prediction of the Democratic Party's decline in the South has also proved correct since 1964. Since 1964, no Democratic candidate for president has captured a majority of white Southerners in his election. The final triumph in Johnson's spectacular first year came with the launching of the War on Poverty. Now remember, this is 1964, 1965, his first 2 years in office. Johnson did not hesitate for a moment in approving plans to develop the anti-poverty assault that Kennedy had first initiated but had never finished. This is my kind of program, Johnson revealed to an aide. It will help people. In designing the Economic Opportunity Act, the EOA, Johnson's administration assembled an assortment of projects providing for job training, remedial education, later to include the preschool Head Start, a domestic Peace Corps called VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America, and community action programs that empowered the poor to help shape policies locally. Johnson typically wanted to provide something for everyone, offering the poor a hand up, not a hand out, while giving more affluent Americans a stake in this effort. Johnson intended to achieve this conflict-free objective through the engine of economic growth, fueled by the income tax cut. By growing the economy and increasing employment, the poor would prosper, but not at the expense of the wealthy. Increasing tax revenues, not tax hikes, would make funding proposals for anti-poverty agencies possible. The logic of economic expansion rather than redistribution guided General Johnson's war on poverty. Things have kind of changed today, as I think you can discern. On May 22nd, 1964, months before, this is the Civil Rights Act, King is right over Johnson's shoulder. The date is wrong, this should be 1964, I typed it incorrectly. On May 22nd, 1964, months before Johnson won re-election by a landslide and vastly increased Democratic majorities in Congress, he had issued a summons for a great society. An expansive slogan, great, that's what Johnson thought in superlatives. An expansive slogan that would identify his forthcoming administration. Not accustomed to thinking small, the president once exclaimed to his cabinet, "There is nothing this country can't do." 8 months before Johnson began his second term, he challenged the graduating class at the University of Michigan to join the battle to build the great society, to prove that our material progress is the only foundation on which we will build a richer life of mind and spirit. All coming out of this were organizations that the government created, like the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Sciences. Again, not just looking at economics, but in an affluent society, you've got to minister to people's minds and souls. Against the backdrop of the swirling currents for social change, and that's a whole other topic I'm sure you'll get into this semester, there's a great deal of activity and militancy going on through civil rights and soon anti-war activity. Against this background for social change expressed by student activists, and especially those in the civil rights movement in the early 1960s, the president pursued these ideals of a great society in his own way, through conventional political means. Though he proclaimed that this was not a time for timid souls, he launched the fight against poverty, racism, substandard education, and soulless wealth in the only way he knew, through an outpouring of legislation. Indeed, the results were remarkable. According to presidential assistant Joseph Califano, of the 200 items of major legislation the administration requested in 1965 and 1966, it managed to obtain a whopping 181. That's more than this Congress, of course, has passed in the last 4 years. Johnson liked to quote the New York Times columnist Tom Wicker, who could hardly believe his eyes as they, quote, rolled the bills out of Congress these days the way Detroit turned super sleek, souped up autos off the assembly line. Of course, this begs the question whether the Great Society's products would prove more reliable and resilient than the Motor Cities. And that's one of the problems. Political problems soon threatened Johnson's vision of the Great Society. A steadfast presidential ally of civil rights, Johnson did not determine the direction of the freedom movement. And in fact, movements, as I mentioned earlier, scared him because he knew they were based on principle. And principle, remember, he thought only appealed to people who were not willing to compromise. When urban revolts erupted in the mid-1960s, mainly in the North, the Johnson administration so closely identified with the cause of blacks, felt the sting of what was called the white political backlash. Republicans riding the wave of white hostility in the 1966 midterm congressional elections gained 47 House seats and 3 in the Senate. This 89th Congress, which had been so active, was replaced by the 90th Congress, which still had Democratic majorities, but had a far less liberal character to it. The president himself recognized the political peril, and in characteristic language grown to Califano, quote, "Negroes will end up pissing in the aisles of the Senate." Hurt, this language reflects the hurt that he felt, hurt by what he considered ingratitude from black people he had done so much to help. To his credit, Johnson refused to back away from supporting civil rights and affirmative action, even after the 1966 midterm elections, which was followed in the next 2 years by even more ghetto uprisings. Indeed, his administration succeeded in passing in 1968, right after the assassination of Martin Luther King, fair housing legislation, which would apply all over the country. And this happened less than a year before Johnson actually left office. If these difficulties were not enough to threaten great society liberalism, Johnson compounded his problem by trying to fight one conflict at home while escalating the Vietnam War abroad. And of course, this is the craw that sticks in the throat of many of those who lived through the 1960s and considered themselves liberals and on the left. And it's Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War. Johnson's reasons for thinking he could be a leader of war and a leader of peace, as he put it, were understandable but misguided. Combining optimism about the widespread effects of economic growth with faith in reason and technical expertise to manage the economy, the president naturally concluded that the government could adequately finance the cost of both domestic and foreign wars without seeking a politically risky income tax increase and without denying our cities, our poor, our aged, our children, and our minorities the assistance they sorely needed. He called it guns and butter. Guns for the war in Vietnam, and butter in terms of the benefits of the great society. Johnson thought he could sustain guns and butter without losing anything. He refused to choose, as he poignantly said, quote, "the great society woman I loved and that bitch of a woman in Southeast Asia." I want to put in parenthetically, Johnson, we now know because of some of these taped phone conversations, started out not entirely optimistic about the Vietnam War. And in fact, a number of people who he trusted outside of the Kennedy orbit had questions about whether the war could be a war that would prove successful to the United States. But he chose, despite doubts in the beginning, he chose to double down. In part, as we'll see, in part because that's what, at that time, liberals believed. And he also wanted to avoid anyone criticizing him for being soft on communism. Because Johnson, as Senate Majority Leader, had lived through the 1950s era of McCarthyism, named after Senator Joseph McCarthy, the Republican senator from Wisconsin, who gained a great deal of power and influence and diminished Democratic success by challenging, by arguing that Democrats were soft on communism, that Democrats had sold out China to the communists and a whole bunch of other things. Johnson lived through that, and he was concerned that unless he pursued Vietnam successfully, the same kinds of problems would emerge. In this instinct, however, Johnson's political instincts undermined him. Whatever the idealism in fighting a two-front war, historical precedent actually warned against it. Even Franklin had switched roles from his, as he called it, Dr. New Deal during the 30s to Dr. Win the War in the 1940s. To win the war, of course, was World War II. Even Roosevelt knew better than to fight this two-front war. Johnson, however, refused to level with either the American people or Congress about the scope of his plans and the price involved for paying them. Impressive as the nation's economic growth was in the early 1960s, it could not underwrite the cost of two wars without running a huge budget deficit and especially hurt the middle class, not unlike the period from 2003 to the present. So long as he hesitated to propose a tax hike to raise revenues, and he didn't want that because it would generate a great deal of opposition politically, and Americans might think if we need a tax hike, this war must be more difficult than we've been led to believe. And we're going to have to sacrifice much more than we've been led to believe. The situation grew worse year by year. In 1967, with nearly 500,000 American troops now in Vietnam from 18,000 when Johnson took office, Johnson finally recommended a 10% tax increase on individual and corporate taxes, but it was too late. Fiscal congressional conservatives exacted as their price for agreement to huge tax cuts, to demand huge spending cuts for what already was an underfunded Great Society social welfare programs. Incidentally, as grandiose as the language was about the Great Society, the programs were never funded adequately to really eliminate poverty in this country. Johnson had incorrectly believed that he could manage an overheated economy, hide the costs from the American public, and postpone indefinitely asking the American haves to make sacrifices from their pocketbooks for the have-nots. Yet, even if Johnson had not wielded guns in Vietnam, it is doubtful that Congress would have been considerably more generous in supplying butter for the war on Vietnam. I'm one of those who doesn't believe that it was the Vietnam War that fundamentally wrecked the Great Society. Despite the widely held view that Johnson's preoccupation with Vietnam destroyed his Great Society, I think the reality is more complex. Even before the chief executive escalated the war in 1965, 1966, legislators had already balked at appropriating anything close to the necessary funds. There's little reason to expect that Congress would have loosened its purse strings, even if there was no Vietnam escalation. The white backlash and rising conservative sentiment, which is often overlooked when we think about the 1960s. We think about the 1960s as this one great wave of radicalism, politically, socially, culturally. But we forget that politically, the 1960s was also the seedbed of the conservative movement that would become a majority politically with Ronald Reagan and his successors. The white backlash and the rising conservative movement, in the absence of Vietnam, would have likely hampered the necessary expansion of anti-poverty programs. As several British politicians found after visiting the United States following those 1960 midterm congressional elections, there existed, quote, an undercurrent of resentment concerning civil order and gains made by the Negro population. President Nixon, Richard Nixon, capitalized on this disaffection in 1968, forcing the Democrats out of the White House and installing Republicans in their place. Although presidential memoirs are typically self-serving, and Johnson's is no exception, one can still agree with the chief executive's judgment in The Vantage Point, which is his memoir. Quote, I was never convinced that Congress would have voted appreciably more funds for domestic programs if there had been no struggle in Southeast Asia. The Great Society failed to meet Johnson's expectations and the expectations of tens of millions of Americans. But overall, we must remember it accomplished a great deal in advancing the post-World War II liberal agenda. Officially sanctioned racial segregation and disfranchisement were virtually eliminated. Public awareness of sexual bias rose, along with increased opportunities for women. Access to health care and education expanded. Poverty did not disappear, but it declined dramatically from 22% of the population in 1960 to 12% of the population in 1970. Even with the Vietnam War, social service expenditures during the Johnson years doubled, increasing from 4.6% to 6.1% of the gross national product. Although the war against poverty and racism, founded on political tensions and overheated rhetoric, Johnson will go down in history for marshaling government as a weapon of compassion and refusing to withdraw unilaterally when the problems proved intractable. However, his same quality of stubborn commitment had disastrous consequences when applied to fighting the Vietnam War. The president, who had hoped to leave the Great Society as his historical legacy, instead drew the country more deeply into a battleground that severely tarnished his presidential image and seriously damaged the health of the liberal legacy. His difficulties did not stem primarily from a lack of experience. Johnson entered the White House knowledgeable about foreign affairs. As a legislator for 25 years, he had participated in deliberations on critical policies related to World War II and the Cold War. As vice president, he had traveled around the world, including a stop in Vietnam in 1961, to assess the situation for President Kennedy. This provincial Texan did lack personal sophistication in his approach to international relations, but he took over the Oval Office firmly grounded in the assumptions that buttressed the conduct of American foreign policy for nearly a quarter century. What are these beliefs that ran from Harry Truman through Dwight Eisenhower, through John Kennedy to Lyndon Johnson? These beliefs revolved around the principle that unless the United States contained foreign aggression posed by totalitarian rulers housed in the Soviet Union or later in China, its national security would be jeopardized. Anti-communists and anti-communist cold warriors beginning with the administration of Truman, enshrined containment as the foreign policy centerpiece of the liberal ideology, a policy that became the consensus within the bipartisan foreign policy establishments, Republicans and Democrats. Johnson and his foreign policy advisors, most of whom were holdovers from the Kennedy administration, did not seriously consider that the struggle in Vietnam failed to conform to their containment views. They did not accept the possibility that rather than a war inspired by the Soviet Union as the latest in its bid for supposedly world conquest, the struggle in Vietnam was really a civil war between indigenous forces which held competing political and economic ideologies. Neither did they fathom that North Vietnam had a legitimate stake in the outcome of the war, not as an outsider, not as a separate country, but as the other half of the nation, which the Geneva Accords of 1954, which ended the Vietnam War with France, had promised unification through free elections, an agreement which the United States had thwarted, hence there were two Vietnams. Had another chief executive, sat in the White House from 1963 to 1969, I think the Vietnam War would likely have turned out much the same. Like Johnson, Presidents Kennedy and Nixon never understood that the United States was fighting on the wrong side of a nationalist, anti-colonial war, a civil war in which the insurgents could outlast America's resolve to wage combat. The most important question to ask is not whether some other president would have kept the country out of war or once involved fought it to a more successful conclusion, but the question is, why couldn't Johnson do either? Much of the answer rests in an examination of the very talents that won him acclaim as the greatest legislative leader of the 20th century, the irony of Lyndon Johnson. What worked so well for LBJ in managing congressional lawmakers failed in conducting foreign affairs. I always believed, he told Doris Kearns, that as long as I could take someone in a room with me, I could make him my friend, including Ho Chi Minh. He conceived of the war, Johnson conceived of the war like a filibuster in the Senate. Enormous resistance at first, then a steadily whittling away, then Ho hurrying to get it over with. After all, this gradual application of pressure, the Johnson treatment, had worked in wearing down Southern opposition to passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Why not against the North Vietnamese president? The ultimate deal maker, Johnson believed every person had his price. Presidential assistant Bill Moyers recalled LBJ exclaiming, "My God, I've offered Ho Chi Minh $100 million to build a Mekong Valley Dam. If that had been labor leader George Meany, he'd have snapped it." Of course, Ho Chi Minh was not George Meany, and he rejected it. Johnson's penchant for seeking consensus with his opponents, the foundation of his legislative liberalism, did not succeed in convincing unconventional leaders like Ho to stop waging social and political revolutions. To the North Vietnamese, promises of building New Deal-style Mekong Valley dams and supplying hydroelectric power were not acceptable trade-offs for abandoning their nationalist goals. Actually, LBJ could deal no better with Vietnamese insurgents who held different values and ideology than with militants in his own country who refused to play by the established rules of the game. It was one thing to negotiate with George Meany, the president of the AFL-CIO, the NAACP, the Civil Rights Organization's chairman, Roy Wilkins, or even Georgia Senator Richard Russell, who battled Johnson on civil rights, but whose loyalty stood beyond reproach. It was quite another thing, however, to communicate with Ho Chi Minh, who more closely resembled the black militants like Stokely Carmichael or anti-war radicals like Tom Hayden, foes Johnson considered illegitimate and beyond the pale of reasonable dialogue. Was Lyndon Johnson the last liberal president, then, of the 20th century? Of course, I titled it. I didn't put a question mark, so I must think yes. Let's look briefly at the two Democrats who followed him in the White House. One of them you see here, President Jimmy Carter. Like Johnson, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton came from the South. And like him, they chose to reject the historic policies of white supremacy identified with their region. Unlike Johnson, their conversion to equality came after a sizable number of African Americans had become voters in the South and could influence the outcome of Southern state elections. In contrast to Carter, Clinton spoke out for controversial racial programs like affirmative action, and he established an authentic rapport with black people that most white liberals could only envy. Nevertheless, neither Carter nor Clinton succeeded in advancing the agenda for racial equality and justice very far. With respect to advancing liberal economic growth and the agenda of liberals, both Democratic successors also fell short. Carter campaigned for the presidency as a Washington outsider, and when he got to the White House, he proved that he was indeed one. His administration worked poorly with Congress, and in the immediate post-Watergate era, Carter had no intention of resurrecting the specter of the kind of big government projects associated with liberals. Jimmy Carter is a far better ex-president than he ever was president. In un-Johnsonian language, Carter declared in 1977, his first year in office, quote, "We have learned that more is not necessarily better, that even our great nation has recognized limits, and that we can neither answer all questions nor solve all problems." By the time Clinton became president in 1992, Democrats were running away from the label of liberal. Smearing Michael Dukakis as a card-carrying ACLU liberal helped George H.W. Bush I get elected in 1988. And Clinton had no intention of identifying himself with the term liberal. In fact, sounding very much like a conservative, in his State of the Union address in 1996, the Arkansas president proclaimed, "We know that big government does not have all the answers. We know there's not a program for every problem. The era of big government is over." Rather than advance liberal objectives beyond a failed attempt to reform national health insurance and a successful family leave policy, Clinton stole conservative ideas for shrinking welfare and funding an expanded program of fighting crime. I'll leave it for you and perhaps question time to decide whether Barack Obama is the first liberal president of the 21st century. Let me just say this here. Having failed to tarnish President Obama as a socialist, Republicans are reverting to using the L word again. The day after the president's second inaugural address, only last week, Senate Minority Leader, Republican Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, asserted, quote, "The era of liberalism is back, and unabashedly, far left of center inauguration speech certainly brings back memories of the Democratic Party of past ages." And he probably was thinking of Lyndon Johnson. This characterization aside, Lyndon Johnson was the last liberal president of the 20th century. A reluctant liberal at first, Johnson's achievements rank next only to his idol, President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Without the Vietnam disaster, and it is a big disaster, LBJ would have left office and taken his place in history, having earned the respect of the American people. Surely an admired, if not a beloved president. He never would have become a beloved president, even without Vietnam. Personality wouldn't have lent itself. As befitting a man of warring tensions within his political soul, Johnson brought modern liberalism to its apex, but also provided the impetus for its decline. Thank you. And again, the political ethic of that time was probably different than it would be today. The kinds of things that allowed him to benefit would have been brought for investigation. In fact, he was investigated. He benefited from his close connection with defense contractors, generally through campaign, finances and campaign contributions. He benefited through his connections in establishing a local radio and television station in Texas, which his wife, Lady Bird, ran for him. So yes, he did benefit by close connections to the military-industrial complex. Obviously, it was closely connected to these lobbyists and financial interests. He probably would have defended it. He would have supported the Cold War anyway. He didn't support the Cold War in Vietnam because Brown and Root or Halliburton told him to do it. Basically, this was the predominant ideology of the time. So I think, in that sense, there's no conflict of interest there. But it also doesn't explain why he would support all of the social, welfare benefits, which he had no economic stake in. Johnson could have run in 1968 because although there's a two-term presidential limit in the country, you have to be elected for 2 terms. And Johnson, of course, was not elected the first time as president. He served out Kennedy's term. He could have run. Johnson, again, is a very strange man. Johnson loved campaigning, but he also had this fear at the same time that he would lose, that people wouldn't like him. Hence his efforts to campaign so strenuously. He wanted to touch people. He wanted to shake as many hands as he possibly could. He somehow craved this need for the approval of people through kind of tactile stimuli, just touching. But he also was concerned that he wouldn't win, and he would get ill. He would become ill, literally. Before a number of his elections, he would be taken ill and say, oh, he's never going to run again. Of course, he'd run again. His health wasn't great in the 1960s. He had suffered from a heart attack. He smoked cigarettes, despite his doctor's advice. But I think if it hadn't been for Vietnam and the fear that he couldn't win, or the fear that in a primary, Bobby Kennedy, with whom for whom he had, the two of them were like, out of a Shakespearean play. Mortal enemies made out of so little, really, when you think about it. Two people who should have been on the same side were they detested each other. Their politics were fairly simple. They detested each other. And the concern that Johnson had was that, Kennedy was going to run against him in the Democratic primaries in '68. And that scared him. Didn't want to lose. And so on March 30th, 1968, without telling too many people, Johnson went on television and said he was not going to run. That came a couple of weeks after the Democratic primary in New Hampshire, the first primary at that time. And it wasn't Kennedy who ran in the primary, because Kennedy himself was not sure what to do. You have two Hamlets vying for the same lead role here. It was Eugene McCarthy, another peculiar man, really, a senator from Minnesota who ran against Johnson. And although McCarthy didn't win, people think McCarthy won. No, he didn't win. He got 40% of the vote, which was a big percentage of the vote to get against the incumbent president. So one suspects that Johnson didn't want to take the chance. Vietnam was not going well. Clearly, the opposition was rising within his own party. There were serious candidates, because he didn't know that Robert Kennedy was going to get assassinated later in the year. And I think Johnson performed the patriotic act. I think he did. I think he could have won, strangely enough, as that might sound, if he ran against Richard Nixon. I think he performed the patriotic act in removing himself in 1968. But we'll never know. First of all, there was a great deal of support nationally now because of Kennedy's assassination. But that doesn't hold completely, because Kennedy died in November. The Civil Rights Act of '64 was not passed until July. As you point out, in the meantime, the South conducted a 3-month filibuster. Those were the days, incidentally, that if you were going to use a filibuster, you actually had to actively be in the Senate and conduct it. It wasn't this new rule, and I'm not even sure when it came up. I mean, it surprised me the first time I heard it, that if you don't have 60 senators, which is the filibuster rule, you need 60 senators to shut off a filibuster. That's called cloture. That's the rule. But now you don't have to actually filibuster. All you have to say is you don't have 60 senators, and that stops it. But back in the 60s, you actually had to do it. And you didn't. And what the South did, and they had done this before, they had done it in the 50s. Johnson had faced a Southern filibuster in 1957 as Senate Majority Leader in 1960. What they would do is they'd organize teams. They'd bring in cots into the Senate chamber. They'd lay the cots out. They'd sleep overnight. One senator would get up, because you always had to have at least one senator on the floor. They'd get up and they'd talk. They could talk about anything. It didn't have to be germane. You could read the telephone directory if you wanted, and what you do is continue to talk. And then another person, you relinquish the floor, and someone else talks, and you keep going. It's in the Senate rules. What Johnson had to do is let these people talk, wear themselves down, but he had to mobilize. So he had to mobilize enough Democratic and Republican. This was also, not only was it a different Democratic Party, it was a different Republican Party at that time. And it was a Republican Party that had what now is a vanished species called moderates. Moderates. Who were willing to compromise, who were willing to make adjustments. And what Johnson had to do is persuade these moderates, through their leader, Everett Dirksen of Illinois, to join together. And the way he did it, of course, talk to them. But he, along with the civil rights leader in the Senate, Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, who became Johnson's vice president, what they would do is they mobilized people to come to Washington. They mobilized businessmen. They mobilized religious leaders. And all of these people put pressure on their constituents, particularly in the Republican Party and some conservative Democrats. So finally, after 3 months of hard effort, persuasion, mobilization, the filibuster was broken in a bipartisan move.